Mr. Melander, thank you. Hey guys, long time no see. Hope everybody's doing okay. I know it's kind of weird situation we're in, but hopefully the weather gets better soon so you guys can spend some more time outside. I am enjoying some tea. It's a white tea, one of my favorites. It's called Bai Hao Injun. Um, Sorry I can't give you guys some leaves to try today. Maybe next time, or maybe soon. But today we are reading chapters 13 and 14 of Mr. Popper's Penguins, and it's called Money Worries, and I am excited to see what happens. So let's get started. So there came a night, however, when Mrs. Popper, having put the children to bed, stopped Mr. Popper on his way to the cellar. "Papa," she said, "I must talk to you. Come and sit down." "Yes, my love," said Mr. Popper. "What's on your mind?" "Papa," said Mrs. Popper, "I'm glad to see you having such a nice vacation, and I must say it's been easier than usual to keep the place tidy, with you down in the basement all the time. But, Papa, what are what are we to do for money?" "What is the trouble?" asked Mr. Popper. "Well, of course, the penguins have to eat, but have you any idea what the bills for those live fish are? I'm sure I don't know how we're ever going to pay for them. And the engineer who put in the basement freezing plant keeps ringing the doorbell and asking for his money." "Is our money all gone?" asked Mr. Popper quietly. "Practically all. Of course, when it is all gone, maybe we could eat the 12 penguins for a while." "Oh, no, Mamma," said Mr. Popper. "You don't mean that." "Well, I don't suppose I really could enjoy eating them, especially Greta and Isabella," said Mrs. Popper. "It would break the children's hearts, too," said Mr. Popper. He sat there thoughtfully for a while. "I have an idea, Mamma," he said at last. "Maybe we could sell them to somebody, and then we could have a little money to live on," said Mrs. Popper. "No," said Mr. Popper, "I have a better idea. We will keep the penguins. Mamma, you've heard of trained seals acting in theatres?" "Of course I've heard of trained seals," answered Mrs. Popper. "I even saw some once. They balanced balls on the ends of their noses." "Very well, then," said Mr. Popper. "If there can be trained dogs and trained seals, why can't there be trained penguins?" "Perhaps you're right, Papa." "Of course I'm right, and you can help me train the penguins." The next day they had the piano moved down into the basement at one end of the rink. Mrs. Popper had not played the piano since she married Mr. Popper, but with a little practice she soon began to remember some of the pieces she had forgotten. "What these penguins like to do most," said Mr. Popper, "is to drill like an army, to watch Nelson and Columbus get in a fight with each other, and to climb up the steps and toboggan down, and so we will build our act around these tricks." "They don't need costumes anyway," said Mrs. Popper, looking at the droll little figures. "They already have a costume." So Mrs. Popper picked out 3 different tunes to play on the basement piano, one for each different kind of act. Soon the penguins knew, from hearing the music, just what they were to do. When they were supposed to parade like a lot of soldiers, Mrs. Popper played Schubert's Military March. When Nelson and Columbus were to fight each other with their flippers, Mrs. Popper played the Merry Widow Waltz. When the penguins were supposed to climb and toboggan, Janie and Bill would drag out the middle of the two portable step ladders and a board that Mr. Popper had used when he was decorating houses. Then Mrs. Popper would play a pretty descriptive piece called By the Brook. It was cold in the cellar, of course, so that Mrs. Popper had to learn to play the piano with her gloves on. By the end of January, Mr. Popper was sure the penguins were ready to appear in any theater in the country. Okay, so that's chapter 13. Sorry about the little hiccups there in my reading. I'm trying to use my phone, and the type is very, very small, and as you guys know from seeing how thick my glasses are, my eyes are not the best. But here we go. Chapter 14, Mr. Greenbaum. "Look here," said Mr. Popper at breakfast one morning. "It says here in the Morning Chronicle that Mr. Greenbaum, the owner of the Palace Theatre, is in town. He's got a string of theatres all over the country, so I guess we better get down and see him." That evening it was Saturday, the 29th of January. The Popper family and their 12 trained penguins, two of them carrying flags in their beaks, left the house to find the Palace Theatre. The penguins were now so well trained that Mr. Popper decided it was not necessary to keep them on leashes. Indeed, they walked to the bus line very nicely in the following line of march: Mr. Popper, Greta and Captain Cook, Columbus and Victoria, and Mrs. Popper. Nelson and Jenny, Magellan and Angelina, Bill Popper, Janie Popper, Scott, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Louise. The bus stopped at the corner, and before the astonished driver could protest, they had all climbed on the bus, and the bus was on its way. "Do I pay half fare for the birds, or do they go free?" asked Mr. Popper. "Janie goes half fare, but I'm 10," said Bill. "Hush!" said Mrs. Popper, as she and the children found their seats. The penguins followed in an orderly fashion. "Say, mister," said the driver, "where do you think you're going with that exhibit?" "Downtown," said Mr. Popper. "Here, let's call it 50 cents, and let it go at that." "To tell the truth, I lost count when they went past me," said the driver. "It's a trained penguin act," explained Mr. Popper. "Are they really birds?" asked the driver. "Oh, yes," said Mr. Popper. "I'm just taking them down to the palace to interview Mr. Greenbaum, the big theatre owner." "Well, if I hear any complaints, off they go at the next corner," said the driver. "Fair enough," said Mr. Popper, who wanted to ask for transfers in that case, but decided to let it well enough alone. The penguins were behaving very well. They were sitting quietly, two in a seat, while the other passengers looked on. "Sorry," said Mr. Popper, addressing everyone in the bus, "but I'll have to open all the windows. These are Antarctic penguins, and they're used to having it a lot colder than this." It took Mr. Popper quite a while to open the windows, which were stuck fast. When he had succeeded, there were plenty of remarks from the other passengers. Many of them began to complain to the driver, who told Mr. Popper to take the birds off the bus. He had repeated this several times. Finally, he refused to take the bus any further until Mr. Popper got off. By this time, however, the bus had got so far downtown that none of them minded having to get out into the street. Only a block ahead of them shone the lights of the Palace Theatre. "Hello," said the theatre manager, as the Popper and the penguins trooped past him. "Sure, Mr. Greenbaum's here in my office. You know, I've heard about these birds of yours, but I didn't really believe it. Mr. Greenbaum, meet the Popper penguins." "I'll be leaving you. I've got to go backstage." The penguins, now standing politely in two rows of 6 each, looked curiously at Mr. Greenbaum. 24 white circled eyes were very solemn. "All you people crowding around the door, go back to where you belong," said Mr. Greenbaum. "This is a private conference." Then he got up to shut the door. The Poppers sat down while Mr. Greenbaum walked up and down the double row of penguins, looking them over. "It looks like an act," he said. "Oh, it's an act all right," said Mr. Popper. "It's Popper's Performing Penguins, first time on any stage, direct from the South Pole." He and Mrs. Popper had thought up this name for the act. "Couldn't we call them Popper's Pink-toed Penguins?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. Mr. Popper thought for a moment. "No," he said, "I'm afraid we couldn't. That sounds too much like chorus girls or ballet dancers, and these birds are pretty serious. I don't think they'd like that." "All right," said Mr. Greenbaum. "Show me the act." "There's music to it," said Janie. "Mamma plays the piano." "Is that true, madame?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. "Yes, sir," answered Mrs. Potter. "Well, there's a piano behind you," said Mr. Greenbaum. "You may begin, madam. I want to see this act. If it's any good, you people have come to the right place. I've got theatres from coast to coast. But first, let's see your penguins perform. Ready, madam?" "We'd better move this furniture first," said Bill. So, that was chapter 13 and chapter 14. Tomorrow we'll do 15 and 16. Again, I hope you guys are all doing well. I miss seeing you guys. I know some of you miss school, even some who said that you would never miss school. Um, but keep doing what you guys are doing. You guys are doing a good job on the Google slides that I've seen. So keep that up, and I will see you tomorrow.